The Bristol Brabazon was conceived at the height of the Second World War. It had an eye on Britain's future civil aviation needs, but with a foot firmly in what had gone before. This week on The Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, we sit down with Alan J. Porter, author of the new book, Bristol Brabazon, the ocean liner of the skies and its ongoing legacy, to discuss exactly that, an aircraft that, for most people who've heard of it, think of it as an utter failure. And that is a word we're going to be looking at a little bit more, because is it apt, and is there more to the Brabazon's story than just what people remember it for now? A very large aircraft that flew a few times and was scrapped. But before we get going, just a little thank you from me for all your continued support of the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have noticed that the channel membership button is now active, because we're going to do channel memberships, link it all up to the Discord, which has been very quiet, so that we can get the AV geekery going quite hard. Of course, if you want to join us on Patreon as well, you'll get all the same things, but on Patreon you'll have fun things like the key rings while stocks last, stickers, and of course, a welcome card from me. This one has a Spitfire on it. Thankfully, there are other ones available. So check out the links in the description below. Prices start from just £3 a month, and everything you can see goes to what we're doing. And I am going to be getting out and about more once this terrible weather that you can't see behind me dissipates, and we can visit some great museums here in the UK and hopefully Europe too. But with that aside, thank you, like, subscribe, do all the usual things. Let's get chatting to Alan, and of course delve into the incredible story that is the Bristol Brabazon. Alan, thank you so much for joining us on this one. I have to admit, I think having read your book, and thank you for sending the manuscript over nice and early, and again, I'll go on record at saying apologies it's taken you this long to get this recorded. I think we've got slightly different viewpoints on the Brabazon, but let's get into it. How did you come to this story? Because I think that's as fascinating a tale as anything. But yeah, I think we're going to have a fun discussion about this.
Yes, I think we have different viewpoints from a few things that you've said and posts that I've seen you on social media. Over 30 plus years ago, I was running a technical documentation department at Filton, British Aerospace as it then was. Primarily working on the Airbus stuff. But when I arrived there, so this was my first job out of college, first day in college, I walked into the then boss's office. I was just a lowly technical writer. And on the wall of his office was this great big monochrome picture of the Brabazon, which I had no idea what it was. And I thought I knew my aircraft, 21-year-old cocky guy straight out of college. I know all my aircraft. And it's like, what's that? And he said, it's the Brabazon. And I was like, what's that? And then pretty much over the next 2 years, any opportunity he would talk to me about the Brabazon and the project. And of course, being at Filton, every time we walked to a meeting or we went across the apron, we walked into the Brab hangar and through the Brab hangar. And I eventually ended up taking on his role as head of technical documentation. My office window looked out at the Brab hangar, and I inherited the big picture of the Brabazon. So I sort of came semi-obsessed with the Brabazon and the story of it. And the thing was, nobody really wanted to talk about it. There was very few people there who wanted to talk about it. And then what it really led to the book was, at one point I was walking back from a meeting around the back of the hangar, and there was a bunch of skips, UK, with a blue manual sticking out of it. And of course, my department was in charge of technical documentation and manuals. I'm like, well, how's that doing in there? So I went and picked it up, pulled it out, and it was a Brabazon service and handling manual. So I was like, okay, got to take that back. And I knew we didn't have any in the department archives because I'd already looked. So I took it and I went to my boss and his boss's boss, and I said, what can I do with this? And they were like, oh, we don't care about that old stuff. You can keep it if you want. So I have, and it's still sitting on my shelf, and it's gone with me everywhere I've moved. And on our probably last move, it sort of came out of the box, and I'm like, you know what? I think it's probably time to tell the Brabazon story. So I pitched the idea to a couple of publishers, and I think the third publisher I pitched it to said, yeah, let's go do it. So this is the story I've sort of waited 30 plus years to tell. And obviously, in the meantime, there's been a couple of other books about the Brabazon. But what I wanted to do was, they're excellent, but very technical. Really good around, if you want to know exactly how the framework of the wings were built and what type of girders they used and stuff like that. Great. But I actually wanted to tell the story of the Brabazon as a character in its own story and put it into its cultural and historical and political context as well as the technical one. So that's what the book sort of ended up being.
Super. And I think well, we may disagree on a few things. The book, I just want to say, the book is very well written and very. You make a very good argument for it. And
Thank you.
You did have me considering my opinion on the poor old Brabazon. I am jaded because I was shooting under handicap on the Brabazon course,
Okay.
and the last 4 holes I completely fell apart. And there you go. So anything with the name Brabazon, I have problems with. But I suppose we should really start at the beginning, because the aircraft comes out of a very interesting moment, isn't it? Because it comes out of the Brabazon Committee. It's mid-war. Things aren't going great. They're starting to turn around, and they decide to start discussing civilian aviation after the war. So I think, what's the sort of potted history of the committee itself and Lord Brabazon himself, who gave his name to the committee and the aircraft? And that horrible golf course outside Birmingham.
Actually, my favorite story, and it's probably slightly apocryphal, but I like it, is, and I have it in the book, is the story of Winston Churchill flying out to one of the summits in Moscow and ending up basically sitting in the bomb bay of a York bomber with an oxygen mask and a bunch of blankets on a seat strapped into the bomb bay, and being flown a circuitous route to Moscow and then coming back the same way, and basically like, this isn't good enough. The American president arrived on a nice airliner and I'm strapped into, freezing my ass off in a bomb bay of an aircraft that's not even a British aircraft, it's an American one. We got to do something about this, goddammit, after the war. And to a large extent, I think that was it. As you said, it was sort of 43. It was the turning point of the war. There was that confidence that we're going to win the war. We're still going to be an imperial power. But during the war, the British focused on fighters. Mm-hmm. Well, the Americans had fighters, but also had transport aircraft and a whole range of aircraft. But there was no transport aircraft being built. We were building fighters and bombers. And it's like, if we're going to continue to support our empire and our friends after the war and rebuild the civil aviation industry, we need new airplanes, because the ones that had been in development just as the war started, those programs were literally stopped. So it was like, we are starting pretty much from a blank sheet of paper. Let's get a bunch of guys together to figure out what that bunch, those 4 or 5 aircraft should be. And Lord Brabazon, who was a fascinating character on his own merit, was, for those who don't know, he was pilot number 1 in the UK. He was the first guy to get a British pilot's license. He actually took a pig up into the air to prove that pigs could fly. So he probably piloted the first cargo flight. And then during the First World War, he developed the art of aerial reconnaissance, and basically was in with, all the Rolls, Charles Rolls. He was in with the Wright brothers. I mean, he was literally there from the beginning of aviation and the start of British aviation. Fascinating guy. He'd retired by that point, become a member of Parliament, had some controversial views. And of course, in those days, if you had controversial views, they didn't fire you, they promoted you to the House of Lords. So he got his title. But really he was a good friend of Churchill. So he was sort of the resident aviation expert in Churchill's cabinet, government, and Churchill's circles of friends. So he was basically given the task of putting together this committee to come up with the base specifications. And they came out initially with 5, of which the number 1 was a large transatlantic airliner to get from London to New York in 12 hours in comfort. And that's where some of the controversy starts, is the in comfort part of it. So, yeah.
I'm going to test you here, because 5 recommendations. We're talking about type 1.
Yeah.
what did the others become? Because there's a couple of quite remarkable aircraft that come
I've
out of
actually
it.
got the book right here. I can see
Fantastic.
it.
I would hope you do.
Okay, so Type 1, transatlantic non-stop.
Mm-hmm.
Type 2, a European transport. Type 3 was a long-range Empire aircraft. Type 4 would be a high-speed transport, primarily a mail plane originally. Type 5 would be a feeder line, smaller aircraft for feeding the mid-range ones. So basically, transatlantic, European, Empire, mail, high-speed mail, feeder plane. Those were the five.
And again, we're seeing, as we're going to talk about here, there's still a lot of sort of circularity with the sort of routes that Imperial Airways were flying, the Empire class boats being mainly built for carrying mail with a few people on top of the mail. So it's that sort of thinking is coming in again, isn't it?
It's very much so. I mean, there was clearly still the view after the war was, or the view during the war, that we're going to win the war. We're still going to have an empire. We still have to support the empire, and we need to maintain close relationships with America. But yes, there was still very much, mail was the lifeblood of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
No email back then, no internet. It was literally bliss. It was literally, paper on literally, let's send documents on planes, around the empire to help the bureaucracy. And if there was a bit of spare space on the plane to take a few people as well, then they would. But, the passenger transport was not necessarily seen as the prime source of revenue. And all the airlines were seen as national flag carriers. They weren't necessarily in business to make a profit. They were in business to fly the flag.
Which is interesting, because I think one of the things I find fascinating about this whole story is it's terribly British.
Oh, it's also British.
Yeah, and because they're, as the day job being a business analyst, you do that level of research as you're beginning a project. You're looking at competitors, their forces as well. Why wasn't the Brabazon Committee looking at what was happening in the States with the build-up of civilian and commercial aviation that they were doing, as opposed to the Imperial Airways model that had been very niche and top end, shall we say?
I think partly because if you look at it historically, air travel in the US was still fairly top end. The idea that the Americans came up with coach class and tourist stuff and started flying around actually didn't start happening until the Brabazon was half built. Even the American one was still the American model was still very much high end. It was still, movie stars in their fur coats getting off the plane and stuff like that.
And movie stars dying on the plane.
Planes or vomiting all over the planes because they were so damn uncomfortable. But it was still, air travel was always seen at that point as high end. So there was partly that. There was a thing about those 5 types. They were designed to be 5 types that could be sold into the American market. There was a thing that we can't create something that directly competes with what we know is going on in the American market. So we're not going to create a version of the DC-3. We're going to fit around it. The idea was that they would help drive this mythical export business that was going to rebuild the Britain and pull it out of austerity during the war and post-war years. There was a very myopic view, that we're going to compete and actually lead the Americans and the Russians, and we're just going to do it the way we did before the war, and it's all going to be fine. It was a very closed mindset of just keeping on going and honoring traditions and trying to think of the future, and instead of sort of shifting to more of a future view. But yeah, as you said, it was a very British attitude.
Reading your book, I just kept thinking that the elephant in the room is the Constellation.
Yeah,
which becomes the fast transport aircraft, C-5 50 something.
Yeah.
But that's the 50s, late 40s, early 50s. That's the model. You get DC4, DC5 come along trying to do it, but Lockheed have sort of nailed it.
Yeah, I think the Constellation was one of the contributing factors. Well, the Constellation and we're getting way ahead of ourselves, and BOSC's infatuation with the Constellation, I think, was one of the contributing factors to what happened with the Brabazon. But during the war, the Constellation was a military aircraft, and they'd only built, I think, about 25 of them. So, but of course, after the war, it was very easy for them to switch that into a civilian model and build a lot more. Yeah.
So we're racing ahead, and of course I can start making jokes about BOAC and British Airways being known as Boeing Airways for most of my career working with them and things like that. But that's a tale for another day. Let's talk about Bristol's, because they are an interesting outfit, because they win the contract for Type 1.
Yeah.
And then another airplane, which I really do like, and which we'll talk about at the end, because the Britannia's fantastic, which also is one of the types. But again, we'll bookend this with something we can probably both agree on at the end. But let's talk about Bristol, because they're one of the original British aircraft companies, synonymous with the town that they're named after. Filton still there for donkey's years. All these fantastic aircraft come out of it. But what's their sort of background? Because they find themselves in an interesting spot when the committee starts making their decisions, don't they?
Yeah. So Bristol, I think, was the 7th aircraft company created. Without looking it up in the book, I think it was the 7th aircraft company, but it was the first one that was designed as a business to build airplanes, as opposed to it being a couple of guys who were trying to fly as a hobby and building airplanes or whatever. The founders basically came out of the tram and taxi business. Saw plane, went in 1909, was in the south of France and saw an aerial display and had the foresight of, this is the next area of transport I want to get into. Also had the foresight of, I'm also going to build a pilot school, because I'm going to build planes. I need pilots who are going to buy them. So he actually set up a training school as well. And that's what Bristol was for a long time, was train pilots, build planes for them to fly. During the war, they had a whole series and a succession of well-respected fighters, medium-sized bombers, relatively small planes. But before the war, I think
I can attest to that. I think I've still got a scar on my head for being in a Beaufighter.
You just made me very jealous being in a Beaufighter. That's very cool.
It was in Australia. It was fantastic.
So they were building great fast aircraft. They had at that time what was probably the biggest aircraft factory in the world, Filton. So when the spec came along for this large transatlantic airliner, it seems on the surface to be something completely. Why would you pick Bristol? They got nothing to offer. The actually opposite is quite true. It was interesting really going and doing the research. In the years prior, they had done a lot of research around large cantilever wings. They'd had, before the war, the big Bombay bomber, which had like a 92-foot wingspan. So they were probably the leading company in terms of theoretical knowledge around the building very large wings. They'd actually also, at one point, designed a 100-ton bomber concept, which was on the basis that, if the UK does get overrun, we're going to build an aircraft that can fly from Canada and have the range to bomb Germany. Crazy. But they did all the development work. They did all the research. They did a lot of the feasibility studies about how you would build and fly an aircraft like that. So that was like, well, we've already done a lot of the research around building a very large transatlantic aeroplane that can fly across nonstop. So they had a lot of the research. And the other big thing that they had was spare capacity, because they had a massive aircraft facility and they had an engine company literally next door. How successful that engine company is, we can debate. But
they sound amazing when they work. All of their engines sound fantastic when they work.
Yes. And my father-in-law worked there, and my late father-in-law there. So sorry, Brian. But they, so they had all these pieces. Had they built something like this before? No, but they had all these relevant pieces that could actually be put together to meet the spec. It's interesting you said that they won the tender. They did not win the tender. They got awarded it. Nobody else was allowed to bid.
Just to say that spare capacity, because at this point they only really have Beaufighter in production,
yes,
don't they? So everybody else is getting into late mark. So Avres is doing late mark. Lancasters, they're doing York, they're doing Lincoln, getting ready for Lincoln. Hawkers is doing Typhoon, or Gloucester's is doing Typhoon, but Tempest, Meteor. Everybody's doing stuff. Bristol
is doing, but they're doing a limited run, but at high capacity, but all within sort of the southwest area. And they've got numerous shadow factories as well around. So yeah, at this point, they very much do have some spare capacity, and they were awarded the contracts on the basis that you can start working on the Brabazon I program as long as it doesn't impact the war effort and doesn't impact the production of the Beaufighter. And they figured out that they could do that.
What is the aircraft that they start to build? Because let's be honest here. It's beautiful. The thing that comes out of the shop. It is, whatever you say about it, whatever, it's stunning. But let's just talk about it. What is the spec that they then designed to? They've done the work with the long range heavy bomber. How does that then start coming across into the aircraft that becomes Brabazon I?
They really start off with a lot of the lessons that they've learned from that. And they start off with the specifications of, it has to fly at a certain altitude. It has to, carry a certain amount of weight. It has to have a certain number of passengers. Originally there was it needs to carry, whatever it was, 100 passengers. It has to have BOAC getting in there. It has to have a restaurant. It has to have a bar. It has to have this. It has to have that. It has to be, carrying people in comfort. It has to have sleeping berths. So when they sort of figured all that out, they sort of came up with an aircraft that had it was a 20-foot diameter fuselage. And then it's okay to get the performance. We need 8 engines of the Centaurus engines to get it off the ground and for it to fly. That means, it needs that means a lot of fuel. It needs big wings. And it very clearly became clear pretty quickly that they were building and designing the largest land plane that had ever been built at that time, to meet the specifications and to meet the performance requirements and to meet the operating requirements. The interesting thing about the Brabazon was literally everything was new. So they were inventing new production processes. They were inventing new techniques. So nothing was really off the shelf. They were even, it was built more like a ship where you lay a keel and then put ribs around it. You look at the photos of the Brabazon being built, and it is just this sort of skeleton of ribs. There was no sub-assemblies. It wasn't like building, the Spitfires that were coming off the production line where various factories were building bits and they were coming together, a bit like a modern aircraft is built. The Brabazon was a bespoke build like a ship. And so they were having to figure out all new ways of doing that and of testing it, trying to make it it was so big, but that meant that they couldn't just slap on aluminium sheeting the way they'd done before. They had to figure out how to make those thinner and more aerodynamic. So it ended up being structurally the most efficient aircraft of the time for its size and weight. So a lot of new technology, a lot of new ideas into it. And as you said, the aircraft itself that emerged is beautiful, big but beautiful. Yeah.
Let's just mention some of the team behind it. So who's leading the design team on?
Originally, it's Leslie Fries, who had done the concept work on the 100-ton bomber. He's been Bristol's chief engineer and chief designer for a long time. And then Archibald Russell, who would go on to be the chief designer of Concorde. He was part of the team. And
that's something we've got to come back to, because the guys on this team go on to do amazing things. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, when you look at the team, team. The interesting thing is the design team were actually not at Filton because of the fact Filton had actually been the target of a Luftwaffe air raid at one point. The decision was made to basically take the design team and actually put them in a house in Bristol, which, considering how many times Bristol was bombed, I'm not really sure of the thinking behind that. But
that was a big raid in autumn 1940, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because Peter Brooker was flying Hurricanes on that one. Sorry, against the raid, not on the raid. He was on the other side. Sorry, that's a little typhoon aside for you there. That was the Wing Commander.
So the design team were up in Clifton in Bristol in a house that they took over, a very nice house called York House. So they were up there. And then the big question became when they were doing the design work, they realized how big it was, is where are we going to build it? And there was nowhere for Filton that was going to be big enough for them to actually build this aircraft as Filton was configured at the time. So their first thought was they were going to build it in Weston-super-Mare at the factory down there. Good idea on the basis that they could then fly off right over the sea. So if anything happened, they would just ditch into the sea. But when they actually started looking into it, the subsoil was too sandy, wouldn't take the weight of the aircraft. So it was back to Filton. And we can probably talk about what they did at Filton to make it viable to build and fly the Brabazon, which changed Filton forever. So there was a lot of interesting things going on. So for my mind, the Brabazon thing is not just the guys who built the aeroplane, but it's the facilities engineers, it's the electricians, it's the guys who ended up building the runway and the Brab hangar, and there are so many other people involved in the whole concept of the project. Who again, some of those the architects went on to do amazing stuff. The electrical engineer guy went on to do amazing stuff. It's not just the guys who designed the aeroplane. There was a lot of top talent on this project.
For the snark I've thrown at this airplane, and while I was reading this, us on Blue Sky, I think we're back and forth a few times about it. They're solving problems that future aircraft are going to benefit from. And
very much so.
That's one of the key takeaways of the Brabazon, because not just the designers are figuring stuff out, but like you're saying, that the subsystem guys as well, working on a very, very large aircraft. That's all of that information is going to be vital to be transferable for what comes.
I'm maybe we're jumping to the end here a bit, but for me, that is the legacy of the legacy of the Brabazon is the knowledge that came out of it.
I'm just seeding that in, because when we start talking about it, I might be a bit mean, and I just want to make it clear that this is an early low score by a fantastic cricketer is basically what it is. As my watch has got the test match telling me what's going on. Let's talk about Filton, because it's the Bristol Airplane Company has been there for donkey's years. It's a part of the fixture, but Filton needs to be, which is already very big, needs to be expanded almost exponentially, doesn't it? It has to be even larger. So that means extended runway, new hangars for build, maintenance, all of these things. What does that do to the area around the Bristol Aircraft Company?
Changes it forever. Yes, probably most infamously is the runway. Is the decision that based on the calculations that the runway needs to be at least twice as long for the Brabazon to take off as the current runway, and then they add in a safety margin, and then two big turning circles, and then a run off either side in case it yaws during taxiing. So it ends up being this design for this mammoth runway, and unfortunately, there's a village sitting right at the end of where this new runway needs to go to. A village that's been there since Doomsday Book times, if not before. Very small village. Very
just for our American viewers and listeners, Doomsday Book is about post Norman invasion, so we're talking thousand years.
The village has probably been there about 1,000 years. Yes, and pretty much overnight, the decision is made to wipe the village out of existence to build this new runway. The villagers only tend to find out about it when newspaper men come knocking at the door and ask them about it. I have a whole chapter in the book about it, but they
very, very good chapter, by the way.
Thank you. Some of the best research we did getting into the Gloucester and Bristol archives was around the fate of the village.
What's the name of the village?
I was going to get to that. So Charlton, that's okay. So the village is called Charlton Village. As I say, it's been there around 1,000 years, and pretty much overnight it is wiped out of existence in a very heartless way. And the residents are told that at some point they will get a new village built, but in the meantime they're just moved off to a new housing estate on the edge of Bristol, and just subsumed into this much larger population when they actually wanted their new village. They actually picked out a site for a new village, and they were told they couldn't put that because there was going to be another runway built that would impact that. That other runway was never built, and that site remained empty until the mid-1990s when a large shopping mall was built on it. So they could have had their village. At the same time as they were building this new runway, demolishing the village, building this new runway over it, they also started building the Brabazon hangar, big 3-bay hangar, which at the time was the largest aircraft hangar in the world. An immense, very imposing structure. And really the legacy of those is that gave Filton the infrastructure to be able to do things like Concorde and Airbus and so forth going on, and really cemented the Filton facility as the leading aerospace facility in the country for many, many years. So both sides of the coin. The way it was handled was not well done. The legacy it left really helped Bristol, British Aerospace, Airbus have that facility for many, many decades and allowed them to build things like Concorde because they had the facilities there.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its 3rd year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, as this year the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum will be opening right next door. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. So we have new facilities, new runway going in. The aircraft starts to take shape.
Mm-hmm.
What's the planning going for bringing this thing together? Because there's nothing really been this big created in a long time. We'll come to build Pegg and the B-36 a bit later, but that's a sort of comparable sort of size of thing that we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
With something ginormous, I suppose, is the only way we can describe it for people who'd never seen, even the people building it, seeing something this large coming together. So what happens when they start bringing this thing together in the shed?
Well, actually, for me, one of the fun stories is what happened to get it in the shed, because obviously, while they were building the runway and the hangar, they still had to keep building the aeroplane. So they actually started to build it in what was called number 2 flight shed, which was the biggest shed at Filton at the time. But it had a very restricted opening, and it also had support columns, so there wasn't a lot of open floor plan. So they had to be very careful with where the jigs were. So in that, they built the fuselage and the inner wings. So jigs on the side, they built the tailplanes and the fin, but they had to build it sort of lying flat because they couldn't stand it up because there wasn't enough room. And then when it got to the point where they needed to transfer it to the still incomplete Brabazon hangar, but there was one bay ready they could move it into, they had to figure out how to get it out of this number 2 flight shed and basically pivot it around some of the support columns. And they figured out if they took a heater off the wall of the number 2 flight shed and took the nose cone off the aeroplane, I think it was literally inches. I think at the front it was like a 5-inch clearance, and at the back it was like a 7 or 8 inch clearance, maybe a bit more. And there's great photographs basically of they hooked a Scammell tractor to the front of it and pivoted it around this pillar and managed to squeeze it out. And there's one point where literally the clearance is probably just a couple of inches of the nose cone for them to actually pull it out, and then they dragged it down across the factory into the new hangar, where they then built the rest of it, and the other sub-assemblies came in, and the engines and the landing gear and stuff, and assembled it. And for me, one of the big things was, even though I used to work there and walk across it, I never really got a sense of how big the Brabazon was until we went back when the place was empty, and I had a picture on my phone of them assembling the hangar in that bay. And I got my phone out and I sort of lined it up with the empty bay, and that was the point. It was like, oh my god, this was a big aeroplane, because each one almost filled one of those bays. The idea was that you could get two in each bay, one built and one under construction in each bay, or two being under maintenance. So the idea of the hangar was it would at one point it gave them the capability of supporting 8 aircraft, either being built or maintained. It's just an enormous structure.
There's that great picture of the one in the bay under construction with the Lancaster parked next to it. And you're just like, wait, it's that big. It, just for a size comparison, something that most people know. Let's talk about engines briefly. Because you say at this point that the Bristol Centaurus is a proven engine. It's kind of a bag of squirrels, really. It's to be kind to it. But there are not only 8 of them in this, they're going to be driving 4 sets of contra-rotating propellers in a sort of V configuration. That's ambitious for an engine that by this point is 5 years late, having first run in 1939, was supposed to be going into the Tempest II, which just never happens until 1947. It's a great engine. It sounds incredible, again, when it works. And if anyone's listening, no, if you're redoing a Tempest or a Sea Fury, put a Pratt & Whitney in it. Don't worry about how many props it's got. If you want it to fly, don't have it in it. But it's incredibly powerful.
Yep.
And they need 8 of these things. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about when you were looking into this, that configuration, because multiple engines driving fewer props have had many airplanes burst into flames or fall out of the sky, as Heinkel found, and others.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. One, it was the most powerful engine that was available off the shelf at the time. And we have to remember that the Brabazon that was built and flew was always designed to be a one-off prototype. The Centaurus engine was not going to be the engine in the production aircraft if it ever got that far. That was going to be the approaches, which is a whole other story.
If you think the Centaurus was late, let's talk about the
So I know a lot of people, it's prop driven and it's, radial engine and it's an old fashioned engine and, but that was never meant to be the engine of a production Brabazon in there. So it was designed for a short operational life as a prototype aircraft on a prototype airframe. I think it was a question of what have we got that's got enough power that can get this thing in the air.
And just so happens to be made by the same company.
And just so happens to be made by the same company across the road, so that makes it cheaper. Now, the original design, the original 100 bomber design and the original Brabazon design actually had the props on the trailing edge of the wing. But they switched, they actually figured out by bringing it to the front and actually embedding the engines in the wing, it would reduce the drag by 25%. And on an aircraft that size, that's a big thing. So I think it was sort of driven by necessity. And by having less props, again, it would reduce the drag, which meant they could, even though the wing was big, they could actually bring the weight of the wing down a bit more and make it more efficient. So a lot of it was around efficiency and lightness and proof of concept. Let's get this thing in the air, and what can we use to get it in the air? What have we got on the shelf, and how can we configure it in the best way?
Just an incredibly expensive proof of concept.
The whole aircraft's a very incredibly expensive proof of concept. So.
Rushing ahead a bit here. Let's talk about when it's rolled out, because when is it rolled out and what is the reaction to it?
Depends what you mean by rolled out. So they did, in 47, they did a rollout When all the major components had actually been assembled in mid 1947, they actually did roll it out. And to your point, this was actually the first time that even the people who'd worked on it actually saw what it actually looked like in terms of size. And they did a naming ceremony, which is, when it ended up being officially called the Brabazon, as opposed to unofficially. Things still had to be fitted, the engines and stuff like that. So still a lot of work to do. So it still took another two years to actually get over some of the issues they were having. When they were putting on, I mentioned the skins earlier, when they were actually skinning the aircraft, they found they were going to actually create panels that were for specific areas of the aircraft for maximum aerodynamic efficiency and weight. So they had to be rolled a certain way and certain tolerances. There was problems with those. They would be right at the edge. The dimensions would be right on the edge, but wrong in the middle. So that turned out to be just the way that rolling technology was at the time. So they had to basically reinvent rolling technology. They were also doing a lot of data testing. They were doing a lot of systems testing. They figured out that they couldn't use DC electrics because you would need a lot of batteries to power an aircraft that size. So, they were the first aircraft to actually put in an AC electrical unit, designed by the Filton facilities manager electrician, not an aircraft electrical guy. There was a lot of stuff going on. So it took 2 years between actually rolling it out and it actually taking off in 1949 before the aircraft actually flew for the first time.
Let's talk about Bill Pegg, because he is a remarkable chap, and he's the man, Bristol's chief test pilot. He's the man tasked with flying this aircraft from the nice new runway at Filton. Sometimes you hear of test pilots taking these things up. You think, was he the right choice? This guy really was the best man for the job, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. The interesting thing was he'd only recently become the chief test pilot. So this was actually the first program where he was totally in charge as chief test pilot. So it was baptism of fire, I guess, being thrown in the deep end for him there. And you mentioned the conveyor earlier. I mean, for me, that's one of the interesting things is before he flew the Brabazon, they flew to Fort Worth in Texas to actually fly the Convair Peacemaker bomber, which was the closest thing, even though it wasn't exactly the same, but was the closest thing to what the Brabazon was going to be like. And he spent a long time out there flying that out and doing long sorties with it. And just that level of collaboration, I think, is interesting between Convair and Bristol, that they would, allow Bill Pegg to come out and fly their prototype bomber. Yeah.
There's a lot of similarities, like the embedded engines and things like that. When you see them side by side, you can see a lot of the same cues for building something that big. Of course, the fuselage on the Brabazon's much wider and things in diameter. But yeah, when I saw that in your book, that made a lot of sense to send your pilot out there to train on that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, Bill Pegg had an interesting career as a test pilot, and I enjoy, if you get the chance, his autobiography is an interesting read. It's very British, but and one of the another thing that came out of the Brabazon Bill Pegg mentions that as a junior test pilot, and when he was test flying things in the RAF and stuff, the way they would test an airplane and capture notes is they would literally have a notepad strapped to their leg and a pencil, and they would, while they were doing strange and wonderful things in these news airplanes, they're actually trying to write notes on the behavior. Obviously, on a notepad on their knee. You couldn't do that with an aircraft like the size of the Brabazon. And the Brabazon was really the first airplane where they started using data capture and data analysis, in the fact that they built a second flight deck inside the fuselage for the prototype, and it had movie cameras monitoring all the dials and everything like that. And then each night they would download them and process them and go through hundreds of hours of data processing and stuff like that. And really the first aircraft test program to do that. And I think some of that was Bill Pegg's idea as well, of new ways of actually capturing what the aircraft was doing. He found it a delightful aircraft to fly, apparently.
I think everyone, when they've seen something with the Brabazon, they see those famous images of it at Farnbrough.
Mm-hmm.
What's the reaction when the aircraft goes to what at the time was probably the world's premier air show? The one that if you didn't display it, you didn't sell your airplane.
Interesting. I think Farnbrough 49. I mean, that became the target. Is we have to get the airplane in the air to get it to Farnbrough for 1949, which they just did. It didn't actually land at Farnbrough. It did a flyover. It did a low speed flyover, and it was very much the star of the show at the time. Great reaction. If you actually watch the newsreel footage, they keep the end of the newsreel footage to just talk about the Brabazon and show the flyover, and that's all very, empire, and this is awesome, and the king of the skies, and this is the future of aviation, and blah blah blah. And the Brabazon sounds beautiful. You just watch that footage. I could watch that footage all day of it just flying over Farnbrough in 49.
And Britain's biggest aviation achievement, Brabazon, took off from Bristol to fly to Farnbrough. When 130 tons of aircraft takes off, it makes a suitable subject for a close-up. The 100-seater airliner came over at really low level, a magnificent spectacle at a magnificent show. In fact, the greatest air show the world has yet seen.
Interesting thing is, of course, 49, the Comet is also at Farnbrough and is hardly given any notice.
With the accent on peace, or so we hope, civil aircraft were obviously very much to the fore. Here's the de Havilland Comet, a 36-passenger jet airliner and the first of its kind in the world.
When you get to 1950, the focus is on the Comet, and the Brabazon is there, but is largely parked up, but does a couple of flies in, parks, does a couple of flybys. By 1951, it is just parked as a static display. The interest is waning as interest in the Comet and the jet engines is coming along. So it's a photograph we have in the book, which for me just tells the whole story, which is really shows the Brabazon fin parked up with a Comet taking off over it. So it's like old age of prop-driven aeroplanes, and turboprops is grounded while the new jets are, smaller jets are going to take over. I find it a very poignant image. But the original reception for the Brabazon was great. I mean, you look at all the newspapers of the day. I think I counted that first flight was covered something like 200 newspapers around the country. Headlines. Everybody was there. I mean, there was 10,000 people at the run at Filton that day, and they didn't even know it was going to be a first flight. Everybody thought it was just going to be another day of taxiing, and there was 10,000 people. The BBC sent news cameras and there was the Pathé News and all the newsreels. It was broadcast on BBC radio in 7 different languages. I mean, just the interest around the aircraft was immense. And a great sense of pride, of national pride around the fact that we could build something like that. And I will say in Bristol today, there is still an immense amount of pride around the Brabazon. But it's interesting how quickly that turned to, what are we going to do with this?
That was, I think that's a fascinating story in and of itself, because this is where the wonderful brains at BOAC start coming back into it, who'd probably overspec their requirements, start buying other airplanes while the Brabazon's in development. You have the Havilland and the Comet. You have all of these things building up as well. What's the sort of decision that really sees work on the Brabazon start to slow as everybody's gaze is pulled elsewhere?
I think it's largely BOAC's decision to buy American aircraft. Even though, interestingly, going back to the Constellation, there was actually a proposal at one point that Bristol build Constellations under license and put Bristol engines in, and they were told we didn't have enough in the dollar reserve for for you to do that. And then 3 months later, BOAC go out and somehow find money in the dollar reserve to buy American aeroplanes. So that didn't go down well.
Yeah. A Connie with constellations would have sounded fantastic.
So there's, I think really
Centaurus engines, sorry.
Yeah, Centaurus engines. Yeah, doing the research, if there's a villain of the piece, it's BOAC. Because, there were guys from BOAC right back on that Brabazon Committee. They were the ones who were pushing for a transatlantic airliner. They had two other guys who were embedded with the design team and were doing the specs. I've been in the archives and seen minutes of meetings with guys from BOAC talking about the interior fittings and what BOC are going to supply the toilets and the wallpaper and the fabrics, and you've got to have this color paint, and there's got to be this amount of room per passenger as per BOAC specs, and BOAC are going to provide information on ground handling because we know how to handle large aeroplanes. So BOAC were all over this project. So there was that implication that BOAC were going to be the launch operator, and they never did. They just gradually just backed away. Then their chairman gives a speech where he says, well, I think we should look at the Brabazon as a national experiment. And it's like, okay. For any aircraft to be successful, it needs customers. And the Brabazon didn't have a customer other than the government. It wasn't an airline, and it wasn't the military. It was a government, and it became an experiment, unfortunately. I think if BOAC had actually followed through, it might have been a slightly different story. I don't know. There may be technical issues why it wouldn't have happened, but I think it would have gone a lot further if BOAC hadn't backed away and become enamored of American airlines. And of course, ironically, then BOAC decide they're going to close down their maintenance facility in Canada and move it to the UK, but they don't have anywhere big enough. So they lease one of the bays of the Brabazon hangar to maintain their American aeroplanes, literally 2 bays away from the Brabazon that they helped spec but don't want to buy.
If anyone thinks that British Airways is any different, they're not, having worked with them for years, decade and a half. They're still like that. So, well, at least they've kept to type. But that's interesting because Brabazon II was spec to have the Bristol Proteus turboprop, which again had issues in its development. Again, very new type of engine, whereas the Centaurus big sleeve valve thing, complicated, lots of power. This is a whole new kettle of fish as well. But that leads us quite nicely into where that engine ends up, because I think we can talk legacy of the Brabazon now, because Brabazon Type 1, Committee Type 1 offering and Type 3 offering, which becomes the Bristol Britannia, that's a success story that does come out of the Brabazon Committee, isn't it?
It is, very much so. And a lot of that is the Proteus engine, but that's the Type 3 Proteus engine before we get to the Britannia. Originally, the guys at Bristol didn't want anything to do with jets and weren't actually given information about jet engines. I mean, this was one of the revelations of doing the research in the book, is the British government deliberately kept information about the jet engines away from other British companies. If you weren't de Havilland or Rolls-Royce, that was pretty much it. They were the only ones given access to the jet engine and jet engine research. And de Havilland got it because basically they were going to do the fast mail plane, which was eventually became the Comet. It's always
that's why they poached Frank Holford as well to do the engines.
By the time that Stanley Hooker arrived at Bristol to try and solve the Proteus problem, he says in his book he walked in and the turboprop department at Bristol Engines was 3 guys in a shed. Bristol Engines had no interest in and no knowledge of jets and turbojets, and they'd literally, when they were looking at how they were going to put it in the Brabazon, they'd literally bent the thing so the exhaust went through like 90 degrees around the back of the engine. It was backwards in the engine, and it was heavy. It was, twice as heavy as it was meant to be and half the power it was meant to be. So Brabazon II basically sat there half complete, waiting for this engine that never really arrived because it had to go through all these different iterations before they got to the Proteus 3, which was actually a brilliant engine.
I think that part of the story is interesting because for all of the ups and downs that the Brabazon itself has, again we come back to this thing that the elements that made it up and that should have gone on to it go on to have other lives of their own and become highly successful. Because you talk about Hooker coming to Bristol's, that suddenly gets you down to Olympus and things like that. You've got the Britannia, which famously
Howard Hughes,
yeah, sort of showed up, flew in his socks, didn't he, and said, I want all of them. And Bristol's went, well, you can't. So you think TWA could have been flying Bristol Britannias in the States as well. There's lots of what's if around it, but it's a fantastic airplane that comes out of Brabazon Committee Type 3, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah. Yeah, it's just the Type 3 spec, yeah. That's one of the things about the Brabazon, as I say, is I think it's not just the technology, but you actually just touched on the people. One of the things is that as the Brabazon program started to wind down, they started to take the people from that program and put them on other programs. So like the Britannia and other things. So there's a lot of knowledge that people have gained on the Brabazon that went into the other programs. And then, unfortunately, as a lot of the British programs in the 50s and 60s got cancelled, a lot of those guys went to the States. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that came out of the Brabazon program that end up in the plane that I'm about to get on in a couple of hours. I have the line in the book that, for me, the Brabazon's DNA sits in every modern civil airliner. There's something, even if it's down to the fact that the cabin is pressurized at 8,000 feet. That's a Brabazon specification. That came out of the Brabazon project. So, stuff like that, to overhead baggage bins, good or bad, Brabazon, idea for the Brabazon. The AC powered flight controls, because the Brabazon was too big for manual flight controls. It was the first one to have hydraulically powered flight controls. So there's a lot of stuff that came out of that got really seeded throughout the aviation industry and still is relevant today.
So for all of my snarkiness about it, and
you're not the only one.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent place to start wrapping up our conversation, because that legacy, like you said, that DNA flows out in so many different directions. So while the project itself was, you could argue, was flawed from various points in it, it does actually give birth to a great many achievements down the road. Yeah,
very much so. I'll accept flawed. I don't like it when people call it a failure, because they achieved what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, I don't think I called it a failure. I just said there's a lot in it that didn't work. But because I think flawed, that's true. Yeah, I think flawed is probably the way to do it from that initial decision of luxury.
Yeah. I'll accept flawed, but yes. But I think the legacy it has is incalculable, to be honest.
When your book is recording this on the 29th, so the book's out tomorrow, isn't it?
Yes. UK release date is tomorrow, yes. And we're doing a launch event on June 7th at the Aerospace Museum in Bristol, where I'll be signing books and stuff.
Superb. I think this episode is probably going to sneak out just after that, because I'm on holiday next week.
Oh, yes. So, yes, you are. Okay.
But I just want, I hope that all goes terribly well. If I can sneak out to Bristol, I shall pop along. But what's the sort of thing is, hey, go buy the book, everybody. For all my snarkiness about the airplane, Alan's written a really, really enjoyable book about the aircraft and the people involved in it. But I guess, that thing we were saying, Flog, what would you like people to think about the Brabazon after they've read your book and been convinced by your argument?
I would like people to understand the Brabazon as a character in its own story, not just as a technical exercise. Like I said at the beginning, the thing I wanted to do was put the Brabazon in its historical, political, social context. So understand why it was built, understand the people behind it. I think when people denigrate the Brabazon as a failure, I think that is doing a disservice to all the amazing people who designed, built, flew, maintained that aircraft, and the influence that that group of people has had on the industry and just travel in general post Brabazon. So I want people to. I'll tell you the story. So I said I set out to make the Brabazon a character in this book. When my copy editor read this, and she got to the chapter about the Brabazon being broken up, which is historical fact, she knew it was going to happen. She got to that chapter and she emailed me and she said, "You just made me cry. They can't do that to our Brab." And I'm like, okay, that's what I want, is people to actually understand what this plane was about, why it was built, and what happened to it, and the legacy it's left us.
Fantastic. Alan, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. Love the conversation.
We'll have to get together to talk Bond and comics.
Oh, definitely.
Because as dear viewer and listener, we were comparing notes about the books on our bookshelves, because mine are not all airplanes as well over here. So thank you so much, Alan. This has been great.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Matt.
I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.